Everyone, I'd like to get us started. Welcome to our weekly Wednesday seminar series. Professor Cito is out of town and she asked me to do the introduction today, which I'm very happy to do. I was just at a panel discussion with our speaker and you were in for a treat. This is an exuberant, full of life person. So Professor Monica White, we are really glad to have you. Thank you for joining us today. Dr. White is an assistant professor of environmental justice at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm already going to deviate from my script, as some candidates like to do. So she told me that she's a colleague of Michael Bell, who's a graduate of this school years ago. I may be the only person in the room that remembers him. And also a colleague of Professor Bill Cronin, who taught here for many years and is really one of the founders of what we now call environmental history. His book, Changes in the Land, about the relationship of Native Americans and colonists to the land in early New England, was formative in beginning to change the view of history as being sort of people-dominated to a more balanced people environment. So it's great to have that contact back to those two people. Dr. White's research investigates communities of color and grassroots organizations that are engaged in the development of sustainable community food systems as a strategy to respond to issues of hunger and food inaccessibility. Her recent publications include A Pig and a Garden, Fannie Lou Hamer and the Freedom Farms Cooperative, forthcoming in the book Food and Foodways, Explorations in the History and Culture of Human Nourishment. Her first book, which is really close to completion, we'll have to have you back for a book signing, entitled Freedom Farmers, Agricultural Resistance and the Black Freedom Movement, is under contract and will come out in fall 2017. Freedom Farmers, the book, revises the historical narrative of African American resistance and breaks new ground by including the work, roles, and contributions of Southern black farmers and the organizations they formed. In addition to her academic work, Dr. White has been active in the food justice movement for a decade and serves as the president of the board of directors of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network and on the advisory board of the Southeast African American Farmers Organic Network. Her work in the classroom and community, and you'll hear, I think, a lot that she's firmly planted in both of those worlds, emphasizes the theoretical framework of collective agency and community resilience, and the use of community food-based food systems and agriculture as a strategy of community development. Dr. White has received several grants, including a multi-year, multi-million-dollar USDA grant to study food insecurity in Michigan. In 2013, she received the Olson Award for Distinguished Service to the Practice of Sociology from the Michigan Sociological Association and the Michigan Campus Compact Faculty Staff Community Service Learning Award. This is a subject near and dear to my heart. She was appointed to the Food Justice Task Force sponsored by the Institute for Agricultural Trade Policy, and starting this winter, Dr. White will provide a quarterly column entitled Freedom's Seeds in the online periodical Journal of American Agriculture, Food Systems, and Community Development. Dr. White received her bachelor's degree from Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan, her master's and PhD degree from Western Michigan University, and did some postdoctoral work at the University of Illinois. Dr. White, we're so glad to have you here, coming all the way out from Michigan to join us. Please welcome Dr. White.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Can you hear me? Wow. I'm really impressed. So you bring food and you talk about food, you get a full house. Thank you all for coming out. Really grateful. It's been 2 years in the making. We've been trying for 2 years to get me here. I'm really honored to be here. I want to thank the Forestry School, Dean Cito, Melanie Quigley, Joan McDonald, and Kristen Reynolds for the invitation and the opportunity to come, for organizing my visit. And I always like to start this work by answering the question, why did I begin this work? And if you were in the panel earlier, then I apologize. But I noticed that there was a drastic difference between the food we had access to in college towns and the food that was available in Detroit. And so really trying to problematize the what we call party stores, liquor stores, and the access or lack thereof of fruits and vegetables in the city. And combining that with the fact that everyone I knew grew food. My grandmother had a container garden. She was in a wheelchair. My dad has always grown food. My sister grew food. Everybody I knew grew food, but the narrative coming out of Detroit at the time did not include people who looked like me. And so I thought it was a wonderful opportunity for me to complicate this narrative by going out and asking questions. Why is it that people are growing food and returning to a very rich agricultural history? So I'll just sort of give you the presentation outline. That was my introduction. Talk about the research questions that are the foundation of the work. Talk about the theoretical framework that our findings have sort of really developed. The methodology of several projects, and if we have time, do both the history of gardening in Detroit and take you on a virtual trip to the D. I hope you're ready. So I always like to root the work in either poetry or in some kind of really sort of a beautiful way to sort of articulate what it is that we do. And bell hooks gives us this. Collective Black self-recovery takes place when we begin to renew our relationship to the earth, when we remember the way of our ancestors. Living in modern society without a sense of history, it's been easy for folks to forget that Black people were first and foremost a people of the land, farmers. So what were some of the questions, the research questions that I seek to discover in my work? One is, what conditions encourage individuals to examine their relationship to food systems? How do individuals begin to see themselves as agents intervening in the food system for their own and their community's best interests? And what strategies do they engage in order to achieve a healthy, sustainable, community-based food system? I'm really sort of interested in how growers, particularly African-American generational Black farmers in Detroit, talk about how do they articulate their reconnection to growing food in this current historical moment. Another set of questions that have kind of come out, how have Black farmers organized in collectives and cooperatives as a strategy against racial and economic oppression, and how does agriculture expand our understanding of a resistance strategy? So I only have 35 minutes and we won't be able to cover all these questions. And so I'm just going to give you a hint and a hit and miss, and we'll have some time for some questions and answers. But this is a part that comes out of the book that I've just finished and on Freedom Farmers. I just got my reviews on Monday. So I thought this was a great time for me to sort of begin to think about how to respond to one of the reviewers' comments, which was, how do we take this historical work that I've done from the Southern cooperative movement of Black sharecroppers and tenant farmers of the late 1960s, early 1970s, and make it current by using the work of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. So you're going to help me just sort of listen as I sort of tease through developing a new chapter on this, and I'm excited to share this with you. So I returned to Detroit to take care of my parents in 2006, and was really sort of struck by what I saw in terms of the urban gardening movement. And as I said, I didn't see people who looked like me, and wanted to really sort of investigate who was doing what they were doing and why. And before I started to do any work, I just sort of I was like a groupie. Any food-related function, any ag-specific activity, I was there taking notes. I just wanted to see what was happening before I did anything. And I have several different kinds of perspectives on it, but I really wanted to focus on African-American farmers who were considered generational Black Detroiters. There are lots of folks who were going to Detroit, had degrees, and were getting involved in the urban agricultural movement, most often upper class, middle class white students who had all kinds of resources that were coming to the city and were really staking a claim in the movement, and were the ones who were shown in Time magazine and other forms of media as here's the savior of Detroit. And so I found that deeply problematic, talking about Detroit as tabula rasa, talking about you can come here and do whatever you want. And those of us who have lived in the city for a very long time and have suffered through some of the economic decline really had a voice and wanted to make sure that that voice was represented in the story. And so it was this framework that led me to the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. Before I could do any work, I needed to see what scholarship was, available on Black farmers, and so I really found a few different conversations around Black farmers. One, we can talk a lot about Black farmers aging, land loss by some of my own very distinguished colleagues. The Daniel piece, Pete Daniel talks about dispossession, the role of the USDA in undermining Black land loss, ownership. 40 Acres and a Mule is Reed and Bennett, and they really focus on Black landowners during various historical periods. And Ali does In the Lion's Mouth, which is an analysis of an organization that I study in the late 1800s, where 1.2 million farmers joined together forces in a cooperative and had trading posts and shared labor and shared seeds and were able to cooperatively purchase land. And so while I looked at the data that presented the articles and the scholarship that was available, I was missing a voice, right? I was missing what was happening and how can we really sort of contextualize the work of Black farmers in Detroit. And so what's missing? What I found missing was really a nuanced analysis of the role of agriculture for Black farmers. So much of what we think about when we talk about African Americans and agriculture is a story of oppression, agriculture as oppressive, tenant farming, slavery, sharecropping. But as I was talking to the farmers of Detroit, that wasn't the lens through which they saw their work, right? That was not enough to get kids out into the garden, and you can't just use that as the narrative, particularly given the historical trauma around these exploitive relationships. So I knew that there were positive reasons that people were involved in agriculture, but African Americans specifically, and I just didn't see that in the literature. Where is a Black farmer's agency? We often talk about what happens to farmers, but we don't often hear people talk about where is their agency and what are the ways that they're engaged in changing the political, economic, and social outcomes of their lives. And I wanted to really challenge these negative assumptions of African Americans having a negative relationship to the land and serving as the reason for Black migration. What I argue is that it wasn't agriculture itself that was what made people leave. It was the exploitive relationships that stood between Black farmers doing what they love and being able to afford a living, particularly given sharecropping, tenant farming, and the dispossession of land, as Pete Daniels illustrates. Very complicated. When I was writing the book, very politically charged character, Booker T. Washington. I found this quote and I thought, wow, you have to put this in here. No race can prosper till it learns that there is as much dignity in tilling a field as in writing a poem. And so most people don't know that about Booker T, and I hope that when the book comes out, I'll be able to come back and just totally blow your mind on what you thought you knew about the founders of the discipline of studying the relationship between African Americans and agriculture. So in the book, I talk about Booker T. Washington. George Washington Carver, I argue, is the father of organic gardening. We look at Rodale, but Rodale was a half a century after George Washington Carver. And Du Bois wrote book-length manuscripts on the importance of cooperatives for African Americans. So people inevitably ask me, why Detroit? Well, one, Detroit is my home, and it's a city that I love. And there has always been just a real sort of this pull. People who go to Detroit, who really immerse themselves in Detroit, have what we call Detroit love. Those from the outside, I met one of my colleagues, her father's from Montana, and he says, oh, where you from? And I said, Detroit. He says, oh, that's a scary place. And I was like, oh, girl, come get your dad. Come get your daddy. And so it's like, well, I mean, that is one image that is portrayed, and if you want to hear that story, you're in the wrong talk. I'm not going to share that. There are lots of documentaries, there are lots of newspaper articles, magazines, and what have you. That will not be the point of this discussion. But Detroit makes a compelling case. I think Detroit makes a compelling case because what we see happening in Detroit is such an extreme, but we do see residuals happening in other predominantly African American, especially impoverished communities. And so I think Detroit offers us a lens through which to understand not only the ways in which people are disenfranchised from the political participation, but also the ways in which communities demand a voice at the table. And so it is that lens, it is that ear to which I point to the community organizations with which I'm working. So, as a city, we put the world on wheels, and we can teach the world how to build sustainable cities where access to healthy food is not contingent upon people's financial resources. People and produce should not be separated. the first urban ag ordinance of 1894 by then Mayor Hazen Pingree, and I'll talk a bit about him, was the first in the nation. And several cities replicated this example with tremendous success. And just last week, or this week, Senator Debbie Stabenow announced the first Urban Agriculture Act of 2016. And so Detroit is centrally located to sort of really teach us, if we can put us on wheels, we can also sort of have the space for Detroit to teach us how to do this food work in ways that are socially responsible. And so inevitably we have people who have a knee-jerk reaction toward the city or against the city, right? One of our own Detroiters wrote this interesting book, Detroit, The American Autopsy. I was disturbed by this title. I met Charlie LaDuff on an airplane, and this was before his book, but if I ever had his ear, I would really chew him out, because I think in order for something to have an autopsy, it must be dead. And the Detroit that I know and love is not dead. So another way of looking at that is, can it be compost? Right? So we know that everything has a cycle, right? And if everything has a cycle, it may not be in the same form, but when we compost, this richness of the soil comes from the decomposition of all that goes into it. This is Passion Murray, who started a company called Detroit Dirt, where they take zoo poop and compost it and make it available for various urban ag projects throughout the city. And so it's the compost framework that the urban ag folks are really endeared to, and looking at the fact that Detroit is transforming, but is it transforming as a result of death or as rebirth? So I just want to give you a little bit of background history on the city, since I talk about, and I know Kristen had talked about earlier, that people think urban agriculture is new. I will say, as she said earlier, as long as there have been people in cities, we've grown food. There's nothing new about growing food in cities. I mean, just generally, there are some new things about it, but in and of itself, where people are, we grow food. So Detroit, the early beginnings when the French settlers came and moved the indigenous off of the land, created what's called ribbon farms. And so this is the Detroit River, and they were about 200 or 300 feet wide, but miles deep, so that everybody's plot had access to water. And so when you go to Detroit, if you see streets like Cadieux, Charlevoix, Gratiot, if they're French named streets, these are the streets where the families had their property. And so the east side of Detroit has this French memory. Another example, the ribbon farms. Here is then Mayor Hazen Pingree, who initiated the Urban Farm Initiative of 1893. And what his idea was, he said, for particularly impoverished communities and people that were unemployed, we had all this vacant land and there were lots of land speculators. He said, hey, land speculators, why don't we let people use the land to grow food? And so people kind of laughed at him, and he said, I believe in this so seriously, I'm going to sell my prize horse at a loss, and bought seeds, and then created community gardens in the late 1890s. This is a group of Polish women, 1890s, and they're headed to what was called the Pingree Potato Patches. Say that quickly. What other moments in Detroit have we turned to agriculture? We've got ribbon farms, we've got potato patches. Not unlike other cities, school gardens were actually integrated into school systems. We had Garden City plots, Liberty Gardens, Relief Gardens, Victory Gardens, and the current resurgence is a follow-up of the 1970s, a USD urban garden program where Detroit and other cities were given money to initiate and to facilitate urban agriculture. So when I say it isn't new, you will believe me. So let's talk about the city proper. Detroit is 140 square miles, which with a current population as of the last census of 688,701. This is down from 1950's almost 2 million residents in the city. Such a drastic decrease, depopulation, then causes all kinds of issues for the city as we try to figure out what do we do with all this land mass. It's estimated that approximately 40 square miles of land are vacant, and this does not include the land that where there are houses that are in various states of disrepair. So what does that look like? Let's just say that GM bought the building and called it the Renaissance. It was supposed to be the rebirth of Detroit. And you see in the foreground, this is an abandoned factory. And what they did, they destroyed the area called Pleasant Ridge, and it was a prominent African-American community in the area to build the automobile factory. And then once the automobile declined, then they left these eyesores and the contamination that follows. So what does depopulation look like? Here's an example, 1949, St. Cyril was a popular Catholic church in the area. Here's an aerial view of a neighborhood. In 2003, this is the same neighborhood. Here, 1949, here, 2003, and in 2006, St. Cyril was torn down. The church was torn down. What does vacant land look like in Detroit? You may have a whole city block with only one house, and really trying to figure out how do we provide resources when the city is so spread out. And so that gives us either a reality of that we have a great moment to think about how do we redesign a city that includes all kinds of green spaces. And so there are some voices that are very loud. And there are other voices that are muted, but the work of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network is one of the voices, the community voices, in terms of some strategies. So what are some of the structural barriers that happen when you have a city that depopulates? One is access to food. I'm sure you all have heard of the contamination of an entire city, lead contamination of Flint, that was getting its water from Detroit. The water shutoffs are happening at a horrendous rate. People are losing their homes because of water bills. And so there are all kinds of issues. As important and critical as food is, water is also contested in the city. Foreclosure crisis is out of control. Schools are being closed. There was a school that had 100 third graders. And I teach college students, so my students are usually they come to learn, but I can't imagine being in a class of 100 third grade. I just couldn't imagine it. Issues of healthcare, bankruptcy, and using the pensions to pay for the bankruptcy and get the city out of, it just really leaves a bleak picture on what life is like for citizens who either chose not to leave or cannot leave. But yet, in the midst of all this, remember, compost. There are opportunities for us to grow, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So I have my students out in the community and doing all kinds of work. And so this particular class, I had them sort of go through the neighborhood to identify where people source their food. What does it look like? So here's the picture that they took. We see soul food. We call them liquor stores, institutions that make the majority of their money from cigarettes, alcohol, tobacco, prepared foods, and canned goods. Here you've got pizza, and they accept WIC and bridge cards. Here, one of my students said, wow, it's interesting that liquor is the largest word. We can be sure that that chicken isn't baked without the skin on it, right? This was a class that I took from the University of Wisconsin-Madison over spring break. And so the students had to go into city stores, and then they went to the suburban stores, and I asked them just to sort of contrast and come back and sort of tell me what they saw. So we looked at these pictures. It was like, oh, okay, wow, look, yours meat deli. Wow, this is interesting. Liquor's still pretty big, but here's a side store, fresh meats, Amish poultry, supposed to be really great, farm fresh produce. But yet we go inside, and what do we see? Beverages from around the world. Want to see the produce section? The produce section. Think about it if you're trying to feed a family and you're in need of accessing healthy food, you don't have transportation and what have you. And so this leaves a particular moment where citizens of Detroit are not sitting there saying, hey, can we get a grocery store? Hey, can you do this? Hey, can you do that? Citizens are engaging in the food system on their own to increase their own access to fruits and vegetables. But before that happened, we needed to speak out to the corner stores, liquor stores, and the people who were doing business in our community to demand that they at least respond to the fact that we were not happy with expired meat, produce that was not available. So this is Malik Shabazz of the New Black Panther movement, and what they did, they went into stores, they took pictures, and they sent those pictures to the USDA. They got stores fined, and they got stores closed. So Detroiters were active in demanding access. This is a picture of a baby. He's not buying a bomb pop, he's buying an apple from a mobile market. I love this picture, peaches and greens, because if you can't come to us, we'll make sure that food comes to you. So let's talk about the social context of Detroit. 83% African American, 30% reported unemployment, and we know that reported unemployment only means that for the last 4 weeks you have not looked for a job. People say it's higher than 50%, the actual rate of unemployment for the city. 20% without transportation, which is ironic given that we're the motor city. And then if you think about without any form of transportation, and those of us who are students, I had a kick and go, I called it a kick and go, that didn't always work when it was supposed to, so they're not also included in this group. 36% below the poverty line, 46% considered functionally illiterate by the National Institutes of Literacy. And Gallagher did a study talking about food deserts where more than half of the population was out of reach of food availability. I put food desert in quotes. We can have a conversation about that later, but the term itself is problematic, and we have to be responsible about how we describe communities, especially if the community members do not feel that that represents their reality. So what are the methods for this? Ooh, this fly, I'm sorry. He's like, oh, keep talking. So the methods came in several phases over the last few years. First, I did a spatial analysis to look at what happens in population shift and what were the city plans for this vacant land, what were the community members' plans for the vacant land, how were we accessing it. The second phase was comparative ethnography, where I did participant observation and in-depth interviews with members of the food justice movement. I concentrated my work on members of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network and also Earthworks Urban Farm, which is a predominantly white group out of the Capuchin Soup Kitchen. They're the only certified organic farm in the city, but they're definitely interested in a food sovereign Detroit. The third phase, which is the material that was for the book, was both historical and contemporary, looking at the origins of agriculture as a strategy of resistance. So that took me into the South. I had a chance to spend some wonderful time with some amazing and incredible Black farmers, and also fell in love with archives, archivists, and the other people who make my heart sing. So out of all of this, what do we know? Right? We know that there are ways that we can explain people's relationship to the land that is not from a deficit approach. We can look at the ways in which people articulate their work from a social justice lens and hear the voices of Detroiters saying that even if there was a grocery store in my neighborhood that sold affordable, healthy food, I would still be doing this work because I need to know where did the seeds come from, what kind of soil was used, how was it fertilized. I need to know. And so given this, I have been able to sort of develop from several different Black farmers cooperatives this theoretical framework that I call collective agency and community resilience. So if I wanted to understand the motivation for Black farmers today, I needed a theory to describe the complexity of race in agriculture, and found that self-provisioning was a way to demonstrate their agency, as a way to rebuild sustainable communities. And so I used collective agency and community resilience as a way to sort of think about how can we capture the depth and the breadth of how they describe their work and what their work means. So there are three parts of my theoretical framework. One is commons as praxis, the other is prefigurative politics, and the third is economic autonomy and independence. Collective agency itself is often studied as a psychological concept or construct. And so when a group of people come together and believe in their mutual success, which is separate kind of consciousness than that which motivates individuals. And so I wanted to begin to think about how is it that the communities come together to create healthy food options where they had been previously denied. And so these are folks that are intervening in the food system on their own behalf, and growing food is only one portion, one way that they could demonstrate and exercise their agency. If we can grow our own food, we can demand better schools, we can, there are other kinds of things. And so food was just one part of this conversation of self-determination and self-reliance. When it comes to resilience, resilience is a word that is growing more and more popular. And I struggle with this as the phrase, because I feel like in a lot of ways, resilience is sort of a way to say, wow, this awful thing happened to you and you bounced back. But I really want to sort of I don't want to lose the structural part of that. I mean, yes, it's great, I bounce back, but also there are structural reasons that cause the situation. And so resilience often ignores the fact, the structural underpinnings of what happened, and allows us to sort of move away from whose responsibility it is to make sure that people have access to food. And so I use community resilience to talk about the ways that communities would adjust, withstand, and absorb disturbance and reorganize while undergoing this change. Community resilience emphasizes the structural approaches to community engagement, including types of indigenous knowledge, emotional experience, intra and interracial exchanges that communities need in order to adapt to unforeseen circumstances. All right. So let's talk about economic independence and autonomy. In terms of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, there are lots of projects that we have ongoing. We have a 7-acre organic farm. We have the Food Warriors Youth Development Program, where we work with African-centered schools. We were initiators of the Detroit Food Policy, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And we're also in the campaign stage of developing a community grocery store, community-owned grocery store. So given the fact that in 140 square miles, in 2007, Farmer Jack closed its doors on the citizens of the city, so no other major chain grocery store existed in the city. Contrast that with a step across 8 Mile Road, and within a 1 mile radius, you might find 3 or 4 major chain grocery stores. The whole city was really without a grocery store. Don't take that to mean that we want more grocery stores, more chain grocery stores, because as soon as that absence was identified, Whole Foods came in, and we had some bumps and bruises, and we were able to negotiate, they were coming. So we were able to sort of negotiate and to have some conversation on what that expectation would be. A few other grocery stores have come in, but the only Black-owned grocery store in the city, actually probably in the state, closed because these major chain grocery stores had come into the city. So this idea of economic autonomy and independence is something that these organizations really struggle with. How do we create a model that is sustainable? How do we use agriculture as a source? And that includes value added, that includes produce straight out of the field, that includes all kinds of activities and programs that go along with that. And so the economic autonomy deals with alternative economies, right? And so we come up with our own D-Town dollars. And so we deal with sweat equity. This is our farm manager, Kadiri, who just got engaged last week on his birthday. Love his hat, Detroit hustles harder. But these are our D-Town dollars. It's a D-Town incentive program to encourage people to volunteer. We do bartering, we do sweat equity, and people can volunteer to be paid in terms of produce. So in addition to economic independence and autonomy, it has to be regenerative and not extractive. And so we identify the fact that a lot of major chain grocery stores function in our city, but yet those resources are not regenerated into our community. And so what we want to make sure is, using a cooperative as a model, the money comes here, it stays here, and people are able to benefit from it. And the last is it's cooperative and collective, and not sort of formally and not engaging. So I'll read this to you. It says, right now in Detroit, residents are practicing self-determination, local economy building, and food security by creating a co-op grocery store. Who? The Detroit Black community is spearheading a project with a mission to facilitate Detroit residents to become more engaged in the food security movement. We run a 7-acre farm, youth wellness program, and a buying club. Why? A co-op challenges a traditional business model. Co-ops are collectively owned by community members who have democratic control over the decision making. So you see, this is also political education. We're saying, we're different. Here's how we're different, and here's what your membership does. It allows you some decision-making benefits. You get to share in the proceeds, and that way it's regenerative. In addition, we're doing a food land acquisition fund where people are donating and are joining, getting memberships for the co-op. And we have listening sessions all throughout the city where we're asking people, what would you like to see? What form would this take for you? What would encourage you to actually join? And so it is this really interactive process. The second part of collective agency and community resilience is prefigurative politics. The ideas behind prefigurative politics for us, outside world may ignore, may overlook, may not ask for our participation, but within our organization, all decisions, one, come from a free space, and that free space or safe space is where political conversations can take place. And so we argue that DBCFSN and the farm are the construction of an alternative political system that is democratic and that processes self-reflection, also called everyday utopias and place-based alternative practices. Most decisions of the organization are given by the membership, and the membership voice is strong and powerful. It gets messy. Right? When you can't make a move until you go to the membership, we're in the process of trying to make some changes to the bylaws. It's a very formal process, but we think it's important to make sure that community members feel committed to the organization and the success. And so we went from having 0 paid positions for several years to then now a staff, and we're trying to find ways to continue to honor the member voice in the decision-making process. As I mentioned earlier, the Detroit food policy was voted unanimously by the City Council. And the purpose is the implementation, monitoring, and advisory body committed to nurturing the development and maintenance of sustainable, localized food system in Detroit, in which all of its residents are hunger-free, healthy, and benefit economically from the food system. What's different from this policy is that it didn't come from a mayor's office. It came from the members of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. We said we need to make sure that there's somebody to respond to food access, and Joanne Watson, council member, said that's a great idea, come back with one. And so in a few years after several community listening sessions, we came back with one. So this idea of commons as praxis, I just am in love with it just because I feel like the community can make decisions for community benefit. And we do things such as community education, both agri-education, adult education. Commons as praxis, to me, this is kind of wobbly. Because the work that I did in the articles was different than what I did in the book, and so now I'm trying to use the work of DBCFSN and to affix my theoretical framework to it, and so y'all work with me a little bit here. So shared resources. How do we make decisions about land? How do we make decisions about water? How do we share seeds, and how do we share our labor? How do we do this collectively? I consider community health and wellness and creating the spaces for all of us to be healthy as a part of that, shared resources. And I think this idea of community art is so understudied. If there are any artists here who really want to do a fantastic, amazing, and incredible project, somebody should give you some money and go throughout these urban ag projects to just take pictures of the art. I think it's just the resurgence of art in spaces that have not seen art. Here are some children for the Food Warriors Youth Development Program, and the community supports the farm, the gardens after the raised beds after the children leave school. We have an ag internship. Here are more members of the Food Warriors Youth Development Program. We offer an Afro-herbalism roundtable because we believe that access to health care is contingent upon who can afford it. And so we do nature walks on the farm, and we talk about alternative medicines and the importance. And so we have some trained folks who offer these classes. We have a food and flavor program for the teens where they grow produce and then create their own value-added products, and then they have to go through and come up with the recipes, and they have to sell it, and it teaches them entrepreneurial skills and communication skills and all kinds of wonderful things to get that teen group involved. We have an 8-kilowatt off-grid solar power station. Here is the Ali Darul who created it. We have a rainwater retention pond because obviously water is an issue, and so we want to make sure that we water responsibly. Yes, this is Baba Kalindi, who created an earth oven on D-Town Farm. We also have a mobile market that has wheels, and you kind of bike around on it. And we also have lots and lots and lots and lots of African art. And the importance of this is to recognize the ancestral cultural connection and to argue the importance of being rooted in community and in culture. So just really quickly, I'm just going to take you to D-Town for a quick second. This is my favorite picture. Somebody stole that sign, but it shows the deer fence. So the first year we had the garden, I was in charge of the tomatoes, and the deer came out and they said, "Yay, tomatoes!" And they were kind of rude about it because they would bite one and they'd go to the next one. You're like, dang, you couldn't leave us any? So we got the deer fence donated, and then the rabbits were like, "Yay, no more deer. We can have all the lettuce we want." And so then we put in smaller cages for the rabbits, and then the groundhogs were like, "We thought they'd never leave." And so most of us are 1 or 2 generations removed from agricultural history, and so this is all sort of a work in progress. Every time something comes up, we're like, "Ooh, how do you handle that?" And people always tell us, "Get some hair." How you gonna hair a 7-acre space? Like, get hair from the barbershop or something like that. Anyway, so we have, we're listed as an agri-tourist site. People come from all over the world to see D-Town Farm. This is Nefera, our very first farm manager, looking at the land before it was tilled. This is the first 2-acre quadrant. This was the year of my tomatoes. This is an aerial view in a Field of Greens, a documentary. They took this picture for us, and that is our first hoop house. We are a regional outreach training center for Will Allen Growing Power, and we do commercial compost, not just for ourselves, but hoping that we can do more for sale. What is a garden or farm without bees? These are our queen bees. Ba-dum-bump. Mama Abba is so bad she does it with no gloves. This is our Rolling Thunder hoop house, which is probably bigger than the stage, and it's so sweet. It's on wheels, and so you grow in one section, and when that's done, you just move the sucker right on down. It takes about 15, 20 people. This is our Will Allen hoop house. They come to Detroit, and they offer their services as for free to us as a fundraiser, and so they educate folks, but we get to make some money off of it. We have mushrooms. This is Mama Jendai holding the mushroom lump. I know that's not the technical term. Don't quote me on that. Given that Detroiters have a lack of access to healthy food, D-Town has agreed to not sell produce outside of the city. And so we only sell in the city. People can buy on site, but we have several locations. And so each Wednesday, we work with Wayne State University's Farmers Market, where the work of Kami Patakuchi talks about how to intervene the university in the food system as a part of the Justice Connection. We continue to introduce many young people to farming. We have a 2-day annual Harvest Fest. You can have your blood pressure screened. We have chefs such as Bryant Terry. So once we grow it, what do you do with it? We'll have workshops on that. We have beekeeping workshops, and so you want to grow a garden. We have all kinds of really fun interactive workshops. Obviously, you have to have hoop houses. It is Michigan. Our Ujamaa co-op is to teach the strategies of buying collectively. And so what happens is I'll buy half a case. I only need a half a case. Can I get somebody else to? So this teaches the practice of cooperative buying, right? And so it isn't just, hey, save money, but how can we pool our resources to buy more at a cheaper price? Our children love to be on the farm. They love to run around with reckless abandon. It's a beautiful sight. Our herb walks, where we have experts kind of say, oh, dandelion is good for nutrition, or this is this plant, it's important for that. Can't have a farm without a ride, a hay ride. This is Kadiri. Keep the hives alive, one of our other beekeepers. And so in this work, I really sort of thought about it. And Detroiters will tell you, members of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network will tell you that their work is political. That some people love to grow a great tomato, other people connect the importance of growing your own food with your own freedom. And so if we can think about protest marches and boycotts as strategies of resistance, are there other ways? What does agriculture teach us about resistance? And I would argue that if we can see this as resistance, can this be resistance? Is this resistance? How about this? This? And at a time when Black men and women are under siege, in cities especially, I think it's important for us to know that there are spaces that we're creating for us to be human, for us to play, for us to explore, for us to examine, for us to demonstrate agency. And don't we all deserve to be superheroes? Thank you. Is that okay? Thank you.
Loudly. Oh, you know,
question.
Here are gardeners or farmers in your backyard. See? Lots of us. There's a question up here.
I'm wondering what you foresee as, if you like, as a generational strategy or a challenge. So, as Cheerios starts to move towards ads where you get biracial families, and so in the future, we have this expectation that black and white won't just be black and white, but they'll be more and more merged. Are you thinking forward strategies as races get more and more mixed, and so people can't identify with one particular group?
So we work with everybody. But we're very clear that the work is rooted in the African American experience. Oh, did I drop? Oh, sorry. Oh, okay, no wonder. I was wondering where that noise was coming. So we're very clear that there are lots of places and spaces for you to learn about white agriculturalists or white culture and so this space emphasizes the Africanness. As societies become more and more biracial, we just want to make sure that the African connection and that there's an honoring of the African traditions of this work. And so when we talk about conventional agriculture versus organic agriculture, back in the 50s and 60s, conventional agriculture is expensive. So most of us were organic farmers and gardeners, but we didn't get the credit. The work of George Washington Carver as a father of sustainable agriculture and the work that he did has been co-opted. And so I don't think it's necessarily a muting of biracial identity. I'm sure that there are spaces and places where people will be able to see themselves in this work. But I think it's just important that given the centuries of devaluing black agricultural labor, we need to recognize the contributions of African Americans, at least for a moment. So everybody's welcome to the party, but if you don't mind, this is going to be all black. I shouldn't say all black, but you can come as long as you're okay with it. And that's the beauty of being a Detroiter. We're not afraid of talking about race. People are like, oh my goodness, you're talking about race. We're like, yes, please, let's talk about race. It's okay. We can use language and talk about everybody's experience is not the same. And so that's, my answer. Yes.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I'm really inspired by what you share with us, and I'm curious about land rights and access to plots.
Sure.
I mean, this work is expanding. I'm sure there's a community that would love to see more plots throughout Detroit.
Yes.
How do you go about acquiring land and protecting it?
Yes. So there are all kinds of ways, right? There are ways that you get land legally and otherwise. Right? And so there are some who say it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. There was also, our organization was pivotal in speaking out against a huge land grab that happened several years ago where a rich, we call him a land speculator because he said he wanted to grow a hardwood forest in the middle of the city, happened to be close to the Detroit River and have all this potential. And the city sold him the land for pennies on the acre with no expectation or demand on how he was going to use the land. And the community members have been trying to buy lands next to them and have not had a chance to. So on the one hand, we're demanding the same resources or the opportunities that they allow to the rich folks who come in. And there are people who are buying land sight unseen, who are holding up progress for the city by not believing that it's commons as Praxis. And so people are buying land and disallowing people, moving people off the land. And one of the things that you find is really interesting is here you have a neighborhood and the land is, the grass is grown maybe 8 feet tall and people are avoiding it. And as soon as a garden comes in and there are kids outside and the crime rate goes down and somebody who has a lot of money is like, oh, this would be a great place for development. And then that land gets sold from under them. So there are all kinds of conversations around land ownership, land protection that are happening in Detroit at the moment that I'm sure other communities that are landlocked, that don't have as much access to land, will be interested in. One of my students at University of Wisconsin is doing work on land trusts in Chicago and what is the history of land trusts and what is the utility of land trusts for current contemporary discussion. So there are all kinds of ways and conversations. We have a relationship with the city because a lot of the folks who were in our organization were the founders. Were members in city politics and also activists given the Detroit history of activism. And so we have a lease agreement. That's why we don't have any permanent buildings. We have to be able to leave if necessary. But it's a $1 a year lease agreement for like 8 years. It's coming up. And so we're going to be ready to renegotiate that. But there are all kinds of people who can buy outright outright, people can buy large, people who just borrow, and all kinds of examples of what happens. So thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Given the sorry.
Thank you, Monica, for your.
Thank you. It was.
I'll just.
Thanks for your presentation. I was really excited to see your idea of commons as practice and to see the cooperative values that are put in practice in different programs and food security. I was wondering if you could illuminate for us actually the organizational relationship between the food security network and the farms.
Sure.
Either or both of those are cooperative, the workers at the farm or the owners of the cooperative.
Or if there's some other cooperative structure.
Sure. So the Detroit People's Food Co-op isn't open yet, but we do have a board. The Detroit Black Community Food Security Network is the organizational parent of D-Town Farm. It is one of our entities. We do have employees, and they have opted to join the co-op, which is legally a separate entity. Does that make sense? The majority of the labor that is done is either done through our paid interns or through volunteers. And so as workers, the few that are gainfully employed, the farm does not operate as a cooperative. The co-op will. So right now it's just sort of like, here's what needs to happen. We have a relationship with the Detroit public school system where we grow food for the schools, and University of Michigan, they send their law students and they help us with legal issues. And so we are a site where folks are able to utilize in terms of what they need, but the farm itself is not at the moment a cooperative.
So given the city's history with industry and how that ties into environmental justice and pollution, especially affecting communities of color, how did the farm approach soil contamination? Was there any?
Sure.
Where did you get your soil?
So the land that we're on is used to be a tree nursery, and it had never been developed. What we do know is that the majority of those plots of land, the blocks that you saw, what the strategy was that when the house was no longer inhabitable, they would dig a hole and they would implode the building into the ground and then cover it up, which then we know lead paint and the toxins then are part of the soil. So our rule is always to assume it is contaminated unless you can test it. One of my colleagues, Sean McElmurray, is an environmental engineer, and he does a tremendous amount of work in the city educating community members on the lead contaminants and the plants and the inhibition and uptake and all that kind of wonderful engineer talk. And so as far as D-Town is concerned, we get tested, retested, over-tested, under-tested, tested in every kind of way. What was really interesting is that the soil is fantastic since it's never been developed. But what we need to also think about, especially if you are think about our parents or becoming parents, the majority of the soil, we know to take our work boots off when we hit the house. We don't always take our shoes off when we walk into the house, and there's a tremendous amount of lead that's on our shoes from a day to day. So say you walk into the house, you have children play on the floor, toy goes in mouth. And so there are some real ways that, but for D-Town Farm, lead has not been an issue, and we test very regularly. And it's a common conversation. Everybody is concerned about the quality of the produce. And we work with several testing entities like Michigan State, University, their extension services. And I want to just make sure that I explain that I approached the organization as someone who was a researcher and then got caught up in the movement. And so this could cause a variety of different kinds of methodological, just some difficulties in terms of, well, how are you studying the group, but you're also a president and so on and so forth. And so the kinds of questions that I ask are not related to the functions of the organization. And it just seemed unethical for me to ask people to give me their time without giving them my labor. And so what I've done is I've thrown myself to the feet and I've said, how can I contribute something meaningful to the work that you're doing? And this book is a tribute to the time and energy that people have given in answering all my crazy questions, in entertaining and taking me around and loving me and giving me my life's purpose. Yes. Oh,
Sorry.
okay, sorry.
Hi, my name's
Hi.
Ethan.
Hi,
Thanks for your
Ethan.
presentation.
Thank
You always
you.
know when it's a great presentation when no one wants to ask the first question.
Really?
You're
I
like,
was
I don't want to
worried.
follow that. I really appreciated your definition of resilience and your comment that it's not just about being able to bounce back,
Yeah.
but it's about figuring out why you were pushed in the first place.
Yeah.
On that, can you talk a little bit about how you work with the city's master plan, and why the city isn't supporting local businesses and helping you procure land and doing a better job of looking into the future in the same way that you all are?
I wish I could answer that question. When I first moved to Detroit, we had put, the gentleman who was buying all the land appealed to the Detroit policy, the city council, and I listened to the decision and the vote from my house in Madison that just felt like it was like a huge blow to the food movement. I don't know why the city isn't listening. I think that they're more concerned about ways to have a quick comeback, and some of those quick strategies are things that are unfounded. We've tried them before. They didn't work then. You cannot assume that the market is going to get us out of a problem that market got us into, right? Industry can't get us out of a problem that industry created. And if you don't listen to people, there are going to be some problems in terms of sustainability and whether or not everybody is treated fairly. There have been a few people on city council that listen to the voices, and there are some ways in which, I mean, it makes the council look good, but they don't want to be on record in support of it. It is just a sticky, like a weird situation, this sort of schizophrenic, hey, we love you, but don't tell anybody. Debbie Stabenow announced the Urban Act on D-Town Farm. And so, it's like, hey, let's do the photo op. But when it comes to making sure that we have the resources that we need to upscale and to provide more food, that doesn't always follow through. So I can't really answer the question why they won't listen. I think that there is this assumption that politicians know best. And that is contentious with people who live in the city and who understand what food access and food insecurity looks like and have experienced it, versus those who come in, like academics, like politicians, who say, we have the answers. And we don't have all the answers. And so it's important that we listen to communities, because the conditions by which people experience can tell us a lot about how we should approach this. And that one thing I really want you all to think about as I leave and go back to Madison, the answers aren't always in our books. Sometimes the answers and the questions can actually be in the community, and we can use the skills and the resources that we have to help them implement ideas and strategies that they already have. But everybody's not listening. Everybody's not interested. And you have people who genuinely say, I don't want horses next door to me, and I don't want this, and I don't want that. So you'd rather have, you'd rather, what would you rather? Politicians and communities. And so that's why we do a lot of political education. We try to talk about why it's important and how beautiful it is to look outside and go and say, oh, I need a tomato, and just pick it yourself and know you grew it. So yeah, it's a sticky situation. I don't have the answer to that. And if you are interested in the research, then let's talk, because we can figure it out together. It's painful. It really is.
That's a great way to end. Let's talk. Professor White, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you.